Hi there. My name is Morgan, but many people online know me as Team Saturboom or even just Saturboom. Today I'd like to try to have a more formal introduction to my card game, MagEx. Now, as I'm doing this video, I'm trying to do it a little bit off the cuff because one of my explicit goals is to be able to describe this card game to people in a more casual manner. So, with that being said, please kind of forgive some of the missteps or odd foibles I might be going through with this video. Trying to do it, say, relatively in one take. But hopefully this should be able to explain the card game pretty well, and if I can basically do this in one consistent take, then I think that might be an example of how well I can explain this card game. So to kind of give a general idea of what MagEx is a card game that is about delivering magical items and scoring points, while also trying to deal with all the shenanigans that other players may be doing. Conceptually, this card game has two particular influences of thought that kind of helped me create this game. The first is probably going to be the most notable one, which will be Magic the Gathering. The second will be Pathfinder. In such a way to try to have a parent of these two, I'm trying to blend some of the aspects of the two, but by virtue of being a card game, Magic the Gathering is probably going to have a stronger influence, but hey, this is all about, say, creating something that I want to make out of it. Nonetheless, when you're playing this game, there's going to be a focus on inventory management and also trying to play as a character to be able to utilize a decent hand to affect other players. When it came to MagEx, how I came up with the game, it was initially back in 2019 where, and it's kind of a stupid story admittedly, I saw a FedEx truck, and from time to time I like doing little fun word plays where I'll just adjust it, and I wanted to say what else can I put with X to be able to create something, and eventually I landed on say MagEx, where it's oh, that sounds like MagEx. I can probably make a card game off of that. So a little about me is that I do like card games, and there's been a number that I have played, and I've also tried making card games previously, but I'll definitely say MagEx has definitely been the most developed of all the ones I've made up to this point. And at least some of the card games of influence, beyond Magic the Gathering and beyond Pathfinder being a tabletop influence, there are some other games that have probably inspired me to try and make my own in such a fashion, notably Unstable Unicorns and Smash Up. These are two great games that I would think that would be really good for anyone who wants to be able to play Magic the Gathering mechanics in a simpler fashion with their friends that may not want to get as in-depth with Magic as others. While I certainly love both Magic and Pathfinder, some of the explicit things I'll definitely say that they have, or one of the main things I'll say they have as a major issue, is just getting new players into them. Magic the Gathering on its own is something that certainly has its own finance issues in terms of trying to make a deck. Granted, there are plenty of ways where you can actually make a very functional and capable budget deck, but there's also just a portion of it in terms of having to explain some of the mechanics and just how text heavy some cards can be. Pathfinder, in addition to Magic, is a game that I think that can be fun, but is also one that requires a lot of reading and going through effectively glossaries to be able to play it mechanically well. At least to say some of the more higher mechanic fashions. So MagEx is kind of say my way of trying to make a card game that is able to embody a lot of the positives of both of them, clearly not all of them, but some of the positives of both of them, but putting in a simpler fashion. At least one of the main things I'll say that's going to make my card game notably different from say these two, at least Pathfinder is a little bit more easy to say because it's a card game, but from Magic the Gathering, some initial things you'll notice as a separate difference is you actually have just looking at some of the cards, you end up having things such as a weight value and a gold value. As I mentioned previously, part of this card game is actually to have some inventory management. Along with that, you actually play with your hand visible as compared to Magic. Something I kind of want to actually encourage players to do is how to create strategies with the hand that they have, and also create strategies against other players based on what they can see. Pretty much in this way that like Magic the Gathering happens to play with the battlefield, you can basically say that everything you do is on the battlefield. Along with that, like say the cards are going to have a focus on being items, so there are no creatures in this game, there aren't enchantments, it's just going to be the items that you do have. And additional to that, you will also end up having all players play from the one singular deck. So everyone draws from this one deck of 100 cards, and they try to make the best of the hand that they have. I'll probably go into more details about some of the explicit mechanics of this card game, but I really just wanted to use this initial video to talk about some of the superficial differences, so that way people can understand like what I'm going for and where I'm trying to head towards. So we already took a quick look at the game, but quick at the card, but we're going to do a little bit more of an in-depth look at it. So in this case, we end up having an item that has its weight and gold value. When it regards to weight, the reason I bring this up is in this card game, instead of having, like, say, a hard limit on how many cards you can have in your hand, what you instead have is a weight limit. So players will have a carrying capacity, and your hand ends up being dictated by how much you can hold based off of weight. So items will have varying weights, and you try to be able to like stay within your carrying capacity and use that hand to the best of your ability. Along with that, you'll notice like as we move down the card after the picture, you'll see like an action ability. At least in my card game, I'll be using these little lines to denote that this is an ability, and everything that'll be beneath that line will indicate this is a part of that specific ability. Next down, you're going to see the quick action. This is going to be the portion where you can see like a lot of it also pulling a little bit more for Pathfinder. I do think the inventory management is something that ends up being a little bit more closer to Pathfinder and understanding like how to avoid being encumbered, but in this case we're using actions that are certainly similar to Pathfinder, D&D, yada yada, to essentially kind of dictate how you're going to be enacting your turn. So there's no mana, you're just using actions on your cards. And when you happen to use an action or whatever the card's ability is, you'll see that it'll mention like what the action actually causes it to do. So in this case, you end up having a mana potion where, as a quick action, if you discard it, you get to draw a card. There's also going to be a denotion of, like, say, the different kinds of actions. There's certainly a lot more to go in the game, but pretty much I want this card to be something that's relatively easy to interpret from a first go and understand like how it works. So these happen to be some of the initial cards that were made, so something to kind of like really tie players into it, some similar concept of like what they're going to be aware of. You're going to have your health potion, your mana potion, and stamina potion. There are going to be a lot more cards they're going to be going into, and as I mentioned, it's going to be a 100 card deck, so there's a lot of cards that are going to be in there that players can mess around with, but in the spirit of trying to make it more of a party game, or at least allow players to play in a way where you don't need to come with a pre-made deck, there's different kind of strategies that can be derived from the different cards that you get. Along with that, before you play, my intention is to be able to have enough cards to where you can kind of decide what cards are going to be in the deck as a group, so you end up having a far more complex game, or a simpler game, or whatever kind of strategies you want to embed in there. At least in terms of how I'm dealing with the roadmap of how I'm doing cards, I do intend to try to have different kind of sets that'll be playing out. So right about now, there are two main sets that I've been working on. There is the base set, which will basically have some of the basic concepts of the card game that I want people to be able to get a grasp of. And then from there, we're going to have different sets to kind of throw like what things can actually be implemented into this card game. One of the more notable ones I'm going with, as you can probably see by the naming convention of this deck, is I'm choosing like Egyptian mythology as the first one to go with. And we're going to try to find a premier card to exemplify it. It's not the one I was going to go for initially, but we're going to go with this one anyway because it's honestly one of my favorite cards that I've made. So we're going to have this card, which is Bow of Neith. But a lot of the cards in the Egyptian set is going to focus on like a lot of Egyptian mythology and really go into detail about different Egyptian gods, or at least like talk about the concept of them. So if you're not familiar with Neith, like this is probably going to make a fun introduction to it. Neith happens to be an Egyptian god that happens to be of like, say, wisdom, but also creation, weaving, and warfare. At least for some people, if they're trying to think of like what this might remind them of conceptually, you could probably say in some ways it might be Athena, but I'm gonna say like let's try not to like assimilate the two. Granted, you can also talk a lot about when it comes to Greek mythology, Eastern mythology, where there's been some different blendings here and there just throughout history, but not the point. The reason I brought this one forward is because Neith is definitely one of, like, say, one of the cooler Egyptian gods that I eventually like started learning about, and this was like, say, an Egyptian god that brought herself into existence based on her own will and manifestation, and that's something that I think like would be really cool to be able to like say talk about more in regards to Egyptian gods. There are going to be different like say like gods in here, like some of them that you're definitely going to be familiar with. Yes, there's Ra, yes there's Anubis, yes there's the Osiris related cards, but there's also going to be some other lesser gods that I also want to point to, and going to create different kind of artifacts that kind of like embody their concept that you'll see throughout this game. At least of now, I'm not going to go too heavily into the mechanics. This is just like an introduction, so people will be a little bit more familiar moving forward. And as I go through these coming weeks, I'm going to try to make some more videos to kind of like really hone in on certain concepts. But I'll also probably be making some different posts, whether it be on Twitter, because I swear I will never call that thing X, on Instagram, Substack. I'll try to make some more things on TikTok, depending on how that fares in the future, but nonetheless, I do want to make sure that this card game is visible in different places. Granted, I will also say, depending on the platform, the way I present it might be a little bit different, because I do kind of use these platforms differently. Anywho, do want to thank you for watching it if you've made it this far, and hopefully this game has caught your interest, and hopefully you'll be interested in seeing where this game is going to be going in the future, and also see what kind of roadmap I'm trying to develop for it. Anywho, thanks for watching. Have a good